Some secrets do not vanish in darkness. They drown in silence. This tale begins upon the mist-draped waters of the Regent's Canal, where a clerk's dying words, "The lock holds more than water," open the way to a labyrinth of smuggling, betrayal, and poetic justice. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The fog is lifting, the current is waiting. Let us follow Holmes into the depths of the canal's hidden truth. The autumn of that year brought with it a bitterness of wind and a greyness of sky, which seemed to cast its pall most heavily upon the waterways of our city. London's canals, those forgotten veins of commerce, lay choked in mist and silence, their sluggish waters reflecting a sky as leaden as the stones of the embankment. Along the towpaths, the footsteps of labourers were muffled by the fog, and the cries of distant bargemen came to us with a strange hollowness, as though the city itself had withdrawn behind a curtain. It was in such a season that the events I am about to recount first touched upon our quiet life in Baker Street. The gloom of the weather seemed to echo the darkness of the mystery which was soon to engage my friend's singular faculties. The Regent's Canal, winding through the heart of the East End, had lately been the scene of an accident, or what was so described in the newspapers, which might well have passed unnoticed but for the strange ripple it cast upon the life of one young lady, who, before that day's close, was to stand trembling at our hearth. I found Holmes seated in his armchair that morning, a pipe between his lips and his gaze fixed upon the fire. The atmosphere in our sitting room was one of rare tranquillity, for my companion had been without a case of absorbing interest for some days, and the enforced idleness had rendered him unusually contemplative. His violin lay upon the table, silent, and several of the morning journals were scattered across the carpet, their columns already marked by his swift annotations. It was while I pondered his abstraction that Mrs. Hudson entered with the announcement of a visitor. The tone in which she spoke betrayed a certain anxiety, as though she herself had been touched by the caller's agitation. Holmes glanced at me, raised an eyebrow, and set his pipe aside with the air of a man roused from pleasant speculation to the sterner interest of his profession. A moment later, the door opened to admit a young lady, whose pale countenance and uncertain step proclaimed her distress more eloquently than any introduction. Thus did the shadow of the canal make its first appearance beneath our roof. The lady who now stood before us was slender, of modest attire, and with a complexion so colourless that it seemed almost transparent against the dark veil she had raised upon entering. Her hands clutched nervously at her gloves, and her eyes, wide and imploring, darted from Holmes to myself before resting, at last upon my friend, as though in him alone could she hope to find some measure of assurance. "My name is Eleanor Harbury," she began in a voice that trembled with suppressed emotion. "I would not have intruded upon you, Mr. Holmes, had I not found myself in desperate need of counsel which no ordinary officer of the law appears willing to supply." Holmes inclined his head with quiet courtesy, motioning her to a chair by the window. The faint light of the November morning fell upon her features, revealing lines of care far beyond her years. She sat with hands tightly clasped, as though bracing herself against a tide of recollection too grievous to be borne. "You have done wisely in coming to me," said Holmes. "Pray compose yourself and tell us all that weighs upon your mind." His voice, though measured, carried that peculiar timbre which so often steadied the shaken heart of those who sought his aid. "My brother," she said, "was a shipping clerk employed at a warehouse on the Regent's Canal. He was diligent, of steady character, and without enemies that I ever knew. Yet a week past, his body was drawn from the waters of the lock near Limehouse, and the coroner's verdict declared it an accidental drowning." At this she faltered, her lips quivering, but Holmes's steady gaze encouraged her to continue. "I cannot reconcile that verdict with what I know of him. He was no careless man, and he had often spoken to me of dangers which, though he did not name them, weighed heavily upon his spirit. The police dismissed these fears as trifling, yet to me They seemed the cause of his distracted manner in those last days. Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Pray, Miss Harbury, what circumstances attended his end?" "He was last seen leaving his office at dusk, and some hours later his body was discovered caught against the timbers of the lock gate. They found no sign of struggle, no mark of violence, and so the matter was closed. But I, sir, cannot rest beneath so unsatisfactory an explanation." "There is one thing more," she whispered, lowering her eyes. "He spoke to me on the evening before his death. His manner was strange, hurried, almost fearful, and he bade me keep courage should harm befall him. As he pressed my hand, he uttered words that I cannot put from my mind. 'The lock holds more than water.'" At this singular statement, Holmes's eyes gleamed, though he made no remark. I, for my part, could make neither head nor tail of such a pronouncement, and I ventured to inquire what she thought he might have meant. "I cannot tell," she replied earnestly. "It haunts me, as though he wished to convey a warning, or some clue to the cause of his end. If only I had understood him sooner, perhaps I might have acted in time." Holmes rose and paced the room in silence, his hands thrust deep into his dressing-gown pockets. The cryptic utterance seemed to have struck some chord within his remarkable intellect, and though he offered no immediate comment, I recognized in his expression the quiet certainty that here, at last, lay a problem worthy of his attention. For some moments the room was still, save for the faint crackle of the fire. Miss Harbury sat with bowed head, while Holmes remained by the window, his keen profile etched against the fog-dimmed glass. I watched as his eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into that thin line I knew so well. The sign that his mind was already weaving its web of deduction from the slightest of strands. At length he turned, his gaze resting first upon our visitor, then upon myself. He did not speak, yet there was in his look the unmistakable intimation that the case had seized him with all its dark potential. Miss Harbury, perceiving this, seemed to draw some comfort from the very silence, as though his calm confidence were assurance enough. Holmes resumed his seat, fingers steepled once more, and inclined his head in a manner that bade her proceed with further detail. I could not but feel the first stirrings of that familiar thrill, the sense that some hidden truth, veiled in fog and fear, was about to be drawn into the clear light of my friend's relentless reason. Holmes leaned forward in his chair, his long, delicate fingers steepled together, and fixed our visitor with that unwavering gaze which few could withstand. Miss Harbury faltered for an instant beneath the quiet intensity of his scrutiny, but his tone, when he spoke, was grave without severity. "Let us proceed with care," said he. "You have given me the outline of your brother's end. I must now know the precise tenor of his last days. Omit nothing, however trifling it may appear, for what seems of no consequence to you may well prove to be the hinge of the whole matter." Thus urged, the young lady composed herself with a visible effort and began to furnish those details which a distracted memory had previously held back. Holmes listened without interruption, his chin resting lightly upon his hand, and I observed how each word seemed to sink into his mind like water into dry soil. His quiet nods and sudden sharp glances assured me that the inquiry had passed from mere curiosity to the stern grasp of his analytical powers. "He had grown restless of late," Miss Harbury continued. "When we walked together, he would often halt suddenly and look behind him, as though fearful of being followed. At first, I made light of these apprehensions, but soon his manner convinced me that some real anxiety weighed upon him. He would mutter of shadows on the towpath, and once I found him staring fixedly at a barge which lay moored in the canal, his face pale and his hand trembling. She paused, her eyes downcast, as though reproaching herself for not having pressed him further. Holmes inclined his head with the faintest movement, his expression betraying neither surprise nor scepticism, only a deepening gravity. "To whom did he allude in his mutterings?" Holmes asked at length. "I could not say. He named no one, only spoke of the danger of prying too closely into matters best left concealed. I had believed it no more than the fancy of an overworked clerk, but now— She broke off, her voice unsteady. Holmes's eyes gleamed for an instant, then sank once more into thought, as though the picture of a solitary figure haunted by unseen watchers had taken firm hold upon his imagination. When his body was found, she went on, the coroner's jury returned their verdict with haste. They declared it accidental drowning, pointing out that the towpath is narrow and treacherous in mist, and that many a man has slipped into the water there. The constable who first arrived swore he saw no mark of violence, nor any sign of robbery. Thus, the case was closed. Holmes's brows contracted slightly. Was Inspector Lestrade concerned in the matter? He asked. Yes, she replied. Indeed, he spoke to me himself. He admitted to me, though not to the jury, that he was dissatisfied. He said only that he could not sustain a charge without evidence, yet he pressed me gently to leave the matter be, as though my interference might bring me harm. At this, Holmes's lips curved in that slight sardonic smile which I had come to recognize as the outward sign of his scorn for officialdom. Evidence is ever the last refuge of the unimaginative, he murmured. We must see whether this case rests upon firmer ground than the coroner supposed. His eyes returned to Miss Harbury, who sat trembling, yet clearly relieved that her doubts found some echo in his. It was but a day before his death, Miss Harbury resumed, that I last saw him alive. He came to me at our lodgings in Bloomsbury late in the evening. His manner was distracted, his clothes disordered, and he seemed to have walked swiftly, as if pursued. He pressed my hand, begged me to trust him, and spoke of a matter that must be revealed in due course, though not yet. I implored him to explain, but he shook his head and grew pale when a carriage rattled by in the street. She drew a long breath. When he had gone, I entered his room. There upon the desk lay a half-finished letter, the ink yet damp upon the page. It was addressed, I believe, to some official personage, though the words were broken, as though his pen had been snatched from him. I left it where it lay, intending to question him the next morning, but by then he had vanished, and the next I heard was the dreadful news from the canal. Holmes inclined forward eagerly. This letter, have you it still? It was taken with his effects by the police, she replied, her voice scarcely above a whisper. Holmes had listened without stirring, but now he rose swiftly and paced the room. Ink-stained fingers, a torn shirt cuff, and a crumpled paper, he said, half to himself. A trifling constellation of facts, yet how suggestive they may become in combination. Turning to Miss Harbury, he inquired, You recall the condition of his hands when you last saw him? They were darkened with ink, she replied. I jested with him upon his careless habits, but he laughed nervously and thrust them behind him. Holmes nodded. It is the habit of the clerk to stain his fingers, yet here the sign points to hurried and unfinished labour. And the cuff, was it torn upon the street, or in the act of writing under compulsion? I could not but marvel at the precision with which he wove together those scattered fragments. To me they had seemed of the merest insignificance. To him they were already bright threads in a tapestry. Miss Harbury gazed at him as though bewildered by the sudden clarity which his mind cast upon her recollections. He fell once more into silence, his eyes distant, his lips compressed, as if the image of that lonely clerk struggling to complete a message hovered vividly before him. At last, Holmes sank back into his chair, the shadow of reflection heavy upon his features. There is always a voice in the unfinished word, said he quietly. A hand arrested in its work tells more eloquently than pages of completed sentences. Miss Harbury clasped her hands together. Then you believe he sought to warn someone? Holmes inclined his head. That he was upon the brink of revelation is beyond doubt. Whether he failed through fear or was silenced by force is the question before us. But mark me, Miss Harbury, the man who begins a letter and cannot end it is oft the man who has glimpsed too much. I could not refrain from a shudder at the quiet force of his tone. Holmes's gaze had grown distant, and I perceived in his manner that peculiar energy which presaged the unfolding of a case to his satisfaction. Though he uttered no vow, his eyes betrayed a decision which Miss Harbury, too, must have read, for her countenance brightened faintly with hope. Thus the shadow of the canal deepened around us, and in Holmes's silence I sensed that the fate of the drowned clerk had passed irrevocably into his keeping. Our journey eastward that afternoon carried us into a quarter of London where the fog lay heavier and the air was thick with the odours of damp stone, tar, and stagnant water. Holmes walked briskly at my side, his thin figure cutting a straight line through the gloom, while I found myself glancing frequently about me, for the atmosphere of the place was of a most oppressive kind. As we quitted the broader streets, the houses grew meaner, their windows begrimed, and their courtyards littered with refuse. The muffled clang of hammers and the distant creak of cartwheels came to us like the laboured breath of the city. Yet over all lay that grey pall, the peculiar fog which seemed to rise not only from the air above, but from the very earth and water beneath. Holmes made no remark, though I knew from the quick dart of his eyes that every detail was noted and stored away. For myself, the silence of the place, broken only by the occasional lapping of unseen waters, seemed to foretell that we approached the very heart of the mystery which had so darkened the life of our young client. Presently, the canal itself came into view, a sluggish ribbon of dark water winding between high warehouses, whose brick walls loomed like prison ramparts through the mist. Upon the towpath, men in corded caps moved slowly beside their horses, leading the heavy barges with the monotonous plod of beasts of burden. The hiss of steam from some neighbouring engine mingled with the guttural cries of the boatmen, producing a din which jarred strangely upon the silence of the fog. As we walked along the bank, I observed more than one labourer pause to cast a wary glance in our direction. Their looks were not openly hostile, yet there was a guardedness in them, as though the intrusion of strangers were unwelcome. One fellow, a hulking creature with a scar across his cheek, leaned against a post and eyed us with a stare which I found singularly disquieting. Holmes, however, appeared undisturbed, his gaze passing lightly over the scene, as though it were but a page in some open volume. He remarked once, in a tone almost playful, that suspicion is oft the most natural cloak for guilt. I could not tell whether he referred to the labourers or to the mystery itself, but I felt instinctively that he already scented a trail. We came at length to the lock where poor Harbury had met his end. The structure was of massive timbers, blackened with age and glistening with the damp. The waters swirled sluggishly between the gates, their surface broken now and again by eddies which turned in silent circles, as though reluctant to be stilled. A chill ran through me as I gazed upon that sombre pool, for it was not difficult to imagine the pale face of the unfortunate clerk rising once more from its depths. Holmes stepped lightly across the beams and examined each portion of the mechanism with a precision that reminded me of a surgeon at his work. He tested the iron bolts, measured the breadth of the gates with his eye, and stooped to peer into the shadows, where the wood met the water. His movements were quick, noiseless, and entirely absorbed. For my own part, I could not rid myself of the image of our client's brother, swept against the timbers by that remorseless current. I shuddered to think how cold and lonely must have been his last moments. Holmes, catching perhaps the direction of my thoughts, cast me a glance half stern, half sympathetic, as though to remind me that sentiment must never impede observation. It was as Holmes bent close to the wood of the lower gate that he uttered a short, satisfied exclamation. With his long fingers, he drew forth several strands of cord, frayed and sodden, which clung to the rough surface like seaweed to a rock. "Observe, Watson," said he softly, "these fibres are not the mere drift of common rope. They have been cut, and at a curious angle. Moreover, see how they are lodged here, against the grain, as though pressed with deliberate force." I stooped, yet to my unpractised eye they bore no great significance. Could they not have been torn from the towing line of a passing barge? I ventured. Holmes's lips twitched with the faintest trace of irony. It is always possible. Yet when chance aligns itself too neatly with circumstance, it is no longer chance but design. Note also their freshness, Watson. They have not long been in the water. He placed the fibres carefully in his pocketbook, his expression inscrutable. For myself, I felt baffled, even faintly uneasy, for it seemed to me that in those sodden threads lay a story which my mind was too dull to grasp, though Holmes already read it as from an open script. Holmes next turned his attention to the muddy bank beside the towpath. The recent rains had softened the earth, and here and there the marks of heavy boots were plain enough. He bent low, tracing the impressions with that peculiar absorption which made his whole being seem concentrated in his keen grey eyes. "See here, Watson," he murmured. "A set of prints leading straight to the lock, but none returning. The earth is unbroken beyond this point." I followed his gesture, and indeed saw the deep indentations of a man's tread, gradually sinking into the mire until they ceased abruptly at the very edge of the lock. My heart quickened at the sight. "Then he must have fallen here," I exclaimed. Holmes shook his head slowly. "Had he slipped, the marks would betray some confusion, a scuff, a drag. These steps are steady, deliberate. The man who made them walked with purpose to this spot, and then vanished." A chill passed over me as I gazed upon that silent evidence. Holmes remained crouched for several moments longer, his brows drawn, his hand upon his chin. When at last he rose, his eyes held the gleam of one who perceives a shape where others see only shadows, and I knew that a deeper puzzle lay before us. Our scrutiny had not gone unnoticed, for as Holmes rose, a low growl broke upon the air. A great brindled mastiff, chained near a moored barge, stood straining at its collar, its eyes fixed upon us with menacing fire. The beast's master, a surly fellow with arms bare to the elbow, emerged from the vessel and called it off with an oath. "What business have you poking about here?" he demanded, his tone rough and suspicious. "This ain't no place for gentry." Holmes regarded him with cool detachment. "We are merely admiring the construction of the lock," he replied smoothly. "A work of great utility, though perhaps perilous to the unwary." The man muttered darkly, cast another glance at us, and busied himself with his ropes. Yet I could not shake the impression that his watchfulness was more than mere curiosity. The dog continued to snarl until he cuffed it into silence. Holmes moved away without haste, his expression betraying nothing of what he thought. To me, the fellow's manner was menacing in the extreme, but my companion, with that inscrutable calm which so often baffled me, seemed only the more intent upon some inward calculation. I knew enough of him to be certain he had observed far more than he chose to reveal. The district of Limehouse has ever seemed to me one of the more melancholy quarters of London, and never more so than upon the day Holmes led me thither in pursuit of our inquiry. The warehouses rose upon either side of the canal, vast windowless structures whose grim facades loomed like the walls of a prison. Within, the air was heavy with the odour of damp wood, mingled with the faint reek of coal dust and mildew. Dust lay thick upon the rafters, and the dim shafts of light which pierced the gloom served rather to intensify than to relieve the shadows. Everywhere the sense of secrecy pressed upon one's spirit. The silence was broken only by the creak of timbers and the scurry of unseen vermin in the corners. I felt, as we moved between those massive walls, that we intruded upon a region less devoted to honest trade than to hidden dealings best left unspoken. Holmes, however, passed along with his usual indifference, his keen eyes darting here and there, marking details invisible to the casual observer. His composure, far from allaying my unease, deepened it, for I had learned that it was ever in the quietest moments that his faculties were most keenly engaged. At length, Holmes led me to a narrow chamber in the upper story, where a desk stood against the wall. "Here, Watson, is where our unfortunate clerk performed his daily labours," he observed. The desk was neat, the ledgers stacked in ordered rows, the inkstand replenished. And yet there lingered a faint air of disturbance which did not escape my companion's notice. Holmes bent low, his long fingers tracing the surface of the blotter. "Do you see, Watson? Here the grain of the paper has been torn, as though some sheet had been wrenched hastily away. The marks of the pen remain, though the words themselves are lost. One does not tear at one's work thus, without cause." I looked closely, but to me the impressions were but formless scratches. Holmes, however, studied them with grave attention, his face half in shadow beneath the dim light that filtered through the window. "The hand trembled," he murmured, "and yet it wrote swiftly. Our friend Hargreaves had matter of urgency before him when he last sat at this desk. What that matter was, we must learn elsewhere." His voice was calm, but I could not fail to perceive in it the undertone of suppressed excitement which foretold discovery. Holmes turned now to the ledgers. One after another he examined them, his eyes flitting rapidly down the neat columns of figures. To me they conveyed nothing but the common transactions of trade, quantities of flour, timber, coal, and sundry goods passing in and out of the warehouse. Yet presently I saw his lips tighten, and a faint gleam kindle in his eye. "Note these consignments, Watson," said he at last, tapping the page with his long forefinger. "Here are goods entered as received, yet their departure is nowhere recorded, and here again, items shipped, but no record of their arrival. A clerk of Hargreaves' precision would not commit such errors. These are deliberate omissions." I bent over the book, but could see only the faint smudge of ink where an entry had been altered. "Surely," I remarked, "the confusion of so many transactions must account for it." Holmes closed the ledger sharply. "Confusion does not erase entire consignments, nor create gaps where none should be. This is the handiwork of men who would cloak their dealings under a veil of regular commerce." The atmosphere of the dim chamber seemed darker for his words, and I felt instinctively that the shadow which had hung over Hargreaves' last days was beginning to assume a more definite and sinister form. Upon a side table lay a small pile of shipping papers, their corners curled by damp. Holmes took one up, and I saw him lift it to his nostrils with a sudden interest. "Ha!" he exclaimed softly. "Do you perceive it, Watson?" I bent close, but detected only the faint, sweet odour which clung to the parchment. "It is but the smell of spice," I ventured. "Precisely," said Holmes. "Cinnamon, with a trace of clove. Yet tell me, what business has such an aroma upon the documents of a warehouse dealing chiefly in timber and flour?" The incongruity struck me at once. The faint perfume spoke of distant shores, of markets far removed from the grey warehouses of Limehouse. Holmes replaced the paper carefully, but his eyes lingered upon it with that peculiar intensity which told me that in so trivial a sign he discerned the outline of a larger scheme. The air of the chamber, already oppressive, seemed thickened by the suggestion. I could not but recall Miss Hargreaves' account of her brother's uneasiness, of his mutterings about shadows. Here, in the faint fragrance of foreign spice, was confirmation that he had indeed stumbled upon traffic which was never meant to bear the scrutiny of honest men. It was while Holmes bent once more to the ledgers that my attention was drawn to a movement in the deeper shadows of the warehouse floor. Through the half-opened door of the chamber, I caught a glimpse of a figure gliding swiftly between the piles of crates. The man was of foreign aspect, his dark beard trimmed close, and he wore a long coat buttoned tightly about him. He moved with an air of stealth, and yet his pace was urgent, as though he feared to be observed. Before I could call out, he had vanished through a side passage, the echo of his footsteps lost amidst the cavernous gloom. A curious thrill of unease passed over me, for there was something in the quick, furtive glance he cast toward our chamber that bespoke both knowledge and alarm. I turned at once to Holmes, but he raised his hand in quiet restraint. "You saw him then," he murmured, without lifting his eyes from the page. "Excellent, Watson. That may prove of greater import than the ledgers themselves." I confess I felt at a loss, uncertain whether we had witnessed the flight of a guilty conspirator or the mere passing of some clerk late at his duties. Yet Holmes's composure, so calm in the face of my agitation, assured me that the incident had not escaped the net of his ever-watchful mind. Holmes at last closed the books and rose, his tall figure outlined against the dim window. "There is a coherence in these fragments," said he, "though the picture is not yet complete. Missing consignments, papers redolent of spice, and a stranger who hastens from the warehouse at the sight of us. All these things, Watson, point to a commerce which does not bear the stamp of honest trade." "Smuggling?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "The word is yours, not mine. But I would say rather that we are upon the track of men who employ the canal as more than a channel for barges. There are currents beneath these waters which bear other burdens than timber or flour." Miss Harbury, who had accompanied us and sat silent till now, clasped her hands nervously. "Then, my poor brother's suspicions were well founded." "Of that there can be little doubt," said Holmes, though his tone remained measured. "He glimpsed what he was never meant to see, and in that knowledge lay the cause of his undoing. Yet the precise manner of it, and the hand that struck him down, must still be sought." He spoke no further, but I could see that behind his calm exterior, the fire of deduction burned ever brighter, casting its first true light upon the dark enigma of the canal. The following morning saw us once more at the lock, the grey daylight lending a harshness to its massive timbers, which the fog of our earlier visit had only half concealed. Holmes moved with deliberate steps along the structure, his keen eyes travelling over every bolt and beam, with the precision of an engineer surveying the work of a rival. He tested the hinges, measured with his cane the breadth of the gates, and bent low to observe the grooves worn deep by years of use. To me the place seemed drearier than before. The sluggish water swirled beneath us with its perpetual whisper, as though murmuring of secrets withheld. Holmes, however, appeared absorbed, his long, thin hands moving with practised delicacy, his features composed in that mask of concentration which admitted no intrusion. At one point, he stood motionless for so long that I fancied he had reached a conclusion, but he merely adjusted his stance and continued his examination. The creak of the timbers beneath his weight and the distant cries of bargemen were the only sounds to disturb the silence. I felt again that oppressive chill which the canal seemed always to cast upon me, as though some malign intelligence brooded in its waters. Holmes at length beckoned me to the side of the lock, where the water foamed gently between the gates. "Observe, Watson," said he, "how the chamber fills and empties at the will of the sluices. The depth varies from a man's waist to twice his height, and therein lies both opportunity and danger." He described, with the clarity of one accustomed to mechanical problems, how a weighted parcel might be lowered with the water's fall and rise, remaining concealed until such time as its retrieval became convenient. "Consider also," he continued, "how a body cast here might be delayed in discovery. The action of the gates would draw it beneath, and only later release it to the surface." The cold ingenuity of the notion struck me with a shudder. "It is monstrous," I exclaimed. "Monstrous, yet effective," replied Holmes gravely. "The very structure intended to aid commerce becomes the accomplice of crime. Few places in London could serve better for the concealment of both goods and men." His words chilled me more than the damp wind which blew across the water. I saw in imagination the lonely clerk struggling vainly in that pitiless mechanism, his cries lost amidst the groan of timbers and the gurgle of the tide. Holmes straightened, his gaze fixed upon the dark surface of the water. "I am convinced, Watson, that Harbury was no victim of mere mischance. He discovered that the lock served purposes other than those of honest trade. Such knowledge, in such a place, is perilous indeed." I asked whether the poor fellow had spoken to anyone of his suspicions. "Doubtless he dared not," said Holmes. "Yet his sister's testimony is clear. He was uneasy, distracted, and fearful. Men who handle contraband trust little to fortune. A single clerk, prying into manifests or lingering too late upon the towpath, would suffice to threaten the entire scheme. His death was not accident, but the silencing of an inconvenient witness." The words fell with a quiet weight which impressed themselves upon my mind. I thought of the solitary figure returning at dusk from his desk, haunted by the sense of shadows following close. The canal, dark and patient, had awaited him. Holmes remained silent for several moments longer, his eyes narrowed as if he could see, through the murk, the very instant of Hargreaves' discovery. "Yes," he murmured at last, "knowledge can be fatal." He saw enough to condemn others, and for that they condemned him. Holmes turned from the lock and paced slowly along the bank, his gaze fixed upon the ground as though retracing each step of the tragedy. "You recall, Watson," said he, "our client's mention of her brother's torn cuff. Such a detail is trifling in itself, yet to my mind it bears the stamp of urgency." "How so?" I asked. "A man may tear his garment in labour or by chance, but a cuff ripped at the seam, stained with ink, and observed upon the very evening of his disappearance, that, Watson, speaks of a hand arrested in the act of writing." The image rose vividly before me. Hargreaves bending over his desk, his pen racing, when suddenly he is interrupted, the paper snatched, the cuff torn in the struggle. The thought lent a dreadful clarity to the evidence. Holmes continued. He was upon the verge of disclosure. That unfinished letter was no idle scribbling. He strove to communicate his peril, and in that effort lay the cause of his death. They could not allow his warning to be sent. I was struck anew by the cold logic with which Holmes traced consequence from so slight a clue. Each fragment seemed to fall into place, forming a pattern both coherent and terrible. Holmes now directed his attention to a cluster of crates stacked against the wall of the lockside warehouse. Their sides were damp with mist, and a faint odour of mould hung about them. Without hesitation, he set to moving them aside, his lean frame bent with surprising strength. "Why here?" I asked. "Because, Watson, men conceal not only goods, but also traces of their haste. If Hargreaves wrote, and if his words were intercepted, some fragment may yet remain." I lent my shoulder to the task, and together we shifted the heavy boxes. At length Holmes stooped and drew from the floor a small sodden scrap of paper, its edges curled and its ink blurred almost beyond recognition. He held it delicately between finger and thumb, examining it in the pale daylight. "There is writing still discernible," he murmured, "though faint. These letters will yield more than appears at first glance." I bent close, but could make out only smudges where the ink had run in black rivulets across the page. Yet I could not mistake the agitation in Holmes's manner. The very existence of that fragment, rescued from rot and obscurity, seemed to him confirmation that the dead man's hand had indeed striven to leave behind a message of dire importance. Holmes spread the fragment upon a dry plank and bent over it with his magnifying lens. The blurred lines resolved under his scrutiny into a few broken words, their meaning dark yet unmistakable. "See, Watson," he said softly, "here is the phrase 'night tides,' and beneath it, though half lost, the words 'red lantern.' The remainder is gone, but these suffice." I repeated the phrases in bewilderment. What possible connection can such terms have with his death? Holmes's eyes gleamed. "They are no mere fancies. The tides of the canal are governed not by nature, but by man's contrivance. Night tides must refer to operations carried out beneath the cover of darkness when the sluices are worked to advantage, and the red lantern. Why, that is a signal, Watson, plain to any man accustomed to the river. It proclaims that the way is clear for certain traffic, unseen by the eyes of law." A sense of dread stole over me as I listened. The fog, the shadows, the furtive glances of the bargemen, all seemed now illuminated by that sinister crimson glow. I could picture the lanterns swaying in the mist, a beacon not of safety, but of crime. Holmes folded the fragment carefully. "We have the dead man's final testament," he said. "In these few words, he has pointed us to the very heart of the conspiracy. It remains for us to follow where he has led, into the tide and the lantern's glow." I shivered involuntarily, for in his quiet tone there lurked the promise of nights more perilous than any we had yet endured. The night was one of those peculiar to London, when the fog seems to thicken with each hour, and the gas lamps glow like smudges of dull orange against the murk. Holmes and I made our way along the towpath with the utmost caution, until he motioned me to a recess near the lock, where we might observe unseen. The air was chill and heavy with the odour of stagnant water, while from time to time the hollow sound of a barge pole striking wood reverberated faintly through the mist. We crouched in silence, our breath hanging in thin clouds before us. The lock lay like a dark chasm, its waters stirred now and again by unseen movement, and the oppressive stillness weighed heavily upon my spirit. I could not shake the impression that we stood upon the very threshold of some discovery, both momentous and perilous. Holmes, however, remained as impassive as stone, his keen profile just visible in the dim light, his eyes fixed upon the waterway, as though it were a chessboard upon which the next move was about to be played. Presently, a faint glow appeared through the fog, swinging gently to and fro, like the will-o'-the-wisp of some marshland tale. As it drew nearer, the shape of a barge emerged, its outline ghostly in the mist. At its prow hung a lantern of red glass, casting a lurid reflection upon the water. Holmes touched my arm lightly. "You observe, Watson? There is your red lantern, no mere accident of colour, but a deliberate signal. It announces to those who wait upon the bank that all is prepared." The vessel glided with uncanny silence into the chamber of the lock. Its crew moved deftly, their voices subdued to whispers, as though even the fog might betray them. I confess a thrill of apprehension ran through me, for the sight of that crimson light glowing amidst the vapour seemed a summons to deeds best hidden from honest men's eyes. Holmes, however, watched with unshaken composure, his gaze intent, as though each motion of the boatman were a sentence in the volume he alone could read. The barge drew alongside the bank, and several figures leapt ashore with the agility of men long accustomed to such nocturnal labours. Their movements were deliberate, yet there was in them a furtive haste, as though each moment of exposure increased their peril. One carried a sack upon his shoulder, another dragged a heavy crate, and all worked in concert, passing the goods swiftly to the shelter of the warehouse wall. The fog muffled their sounds, but I could hear the dull thud of wood upon stone and the quickened breathing of men bent to a secret task. My unease deepened with each passing minute. These were no common bargemen plying their honest trade, but conspirators, practised and wary, intent upon concealing what they dared not declare. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Mark their discipline, Watson," he whispered. "This is no casual theft, but a system, rehearsed and perfected. Each man knows his part." A.K. Faint rustle behind us made me start, and I realized that the very mist seemed alive with hidden presences. The men below moved like shadows, and the lantern's glow revealed faces strained and intent, their features momentarily illumined, only to vanish again into darkness. It was at that instant, when the silence pressed most heavily, that a sudden sound behind us startled me from my composure. A loose stone shifted under my knee, falling with a splash into the water below. The noise, slight though it was, seemed to ring out with the force of a pistol shot. I felt a surge of panic, and in my clumsiness would have risen, had not Holmes's hand descended upon my arm with the firmness of iron. His lips brushed close to my ear. "Steady, Watson," he murmured, scarcely above a breath. "We are unseen yet. Do not betray us now." Chastened by his calm authority, I forced myself once more into stillness, though my heart beat so violently I feared it must betray us. Below, one of the men paused, his head lifted as though scenting danger in the fog. For several seconds he stood thus, then, reassured perhaps by the stillness, returned to his task. Holmes released my arm gently, his expression unchanged, though in his eyes there was a gleam of amusement, not untouched with reproach. From our hiding place we could now hear, borne faintly through the vapour, the voices of the men upon the bank. Their words came in fragments, half lost in the muffled air, yet enough reached us to chill my blood. "Careful with that crate. The inspector must not suspect. Tonight's tide favours us." Another voice, deeper and harsher, interjected. "And that clerk, Harbury, he knew too much. Best he lies quiet now." The effect upon me was instantaneous. Here, at last, was confirmation of foul play. I turned in agitation to my companion, but Holmes pressed a finger silently to his lips. His eyes gleamed with that peculiar fire which I had learned to associate with triumph upon the scent. The men moved steadily, their words dropping like stones into a dark pool. Hints of routes, signals, and payments, couched in phrases meant to conceal, but to Holmes, transparent as glass. I marvelled at his composure, while my own nerves quivered at the thought that we crouched but yards from men capable of murder. Still, he remained motionless, his entire being absorbed in drinking in each syllable, as though every word confirmed a structure already built within his mind. When the work below had reached its end, Holmes rose with the utmost caution, signalling that we should withdraw. His movements were noiseless, yet precise, as though he knew that discovery now would undo all that we had learned. I followed in silence, my limbs stiff with tension, until the sounds of the smuggler's labour faded behind us into the fog. At last, when we had gained the shelter of a narrow lane leading from the towpath, Holmes turned, and in the dim light I saw that strange gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. He spoke not a word, but the curve of his lips told me he had gleaned precisely what he sought. I could contain myself no longer. "Holmes, you heard them. They spoke of Harbury." He raised his hand for silence. "Not here, Watson. The night has ears. We must preserve our advantage until the moment is ripe." I bowed to his judgment, though my heart burned with questions. As we passed once more into the obscurity of the city, I felt that the mists of the canal, far from concealing, had revealed at last the true shadow which hung over Eleanor Harbury's fate. Holmes wasted no time upon our return from the canal. Within the hour, we were closeted with Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard, where Holmes unfolded with his usual lucidity the chain of evidence now before us. The red lantern, the whispered admission of Harbury's fate, and the irregularities in the shipping manifests, all pointed with irresistible force toward Limehouse as the seat of operations. Lestrade, though sceptical at the outset, could not withstand the calm assurance with which Holmes laid his scheme before him. "Station your men in the shadows of the dockside warehouses," said Holmes. "Let them remain unseen until the signal is given. At the moment when the cargo is landed, surround them on every side. Their resistance will be sharp but brief. These are not men bred for open battle." The inspector, whose zeal was often more conspicuous than his subtlety, agreed with alacrity. I observed a faint smile flicker upon Holmes's lips as he saw his directions taken without question. For myself, I marvelled once more at the ease with which he bent officialdom to his design. By evening the arrangements were complete, and it was with a curious sense of foreboding that I accompanied Holmes and Lestrade to the appointed ground, where the shadows of Limehouse awaited us. The docks of Limehouse by night presented a scene at once eerie and forbidding. A pall of mist hung low upon the water, drifting in pale wreaths among the masts that loomed like phantoms against the dim sky. From the warehouses came the faint creak of timber and the dull resonance of chains, but for the most part the silence was profound, broken only by the distant cry of a gull or the lapping of the tide against the piles. Holmes and I took our station in a recess between two great sheds, while Lestrade's men distributed themselves with practised caution about the wharf. Their figures melted into the gloom until the quay appeared deserted, save for ourselves. I confess a chill of unease ran through me as I peered into the swirling vapour, for it seemed that we waited not for men of flesh and blood, but for spectres summoned from the darkness. Holmes, however, remained motionless, his keen eyes fixed upon the black ribbon of the river. His stillness, so absolute amidst the tremor of my own nerves, impressed itself upon me with a power more eloquent than words. Thus we waited, silent and expectant, until at last a faint glow emerged upon the water and the hour of trial was at hand. From out of the fog there glided a barge, its prow low in the water beneath the weight of its cargo. At its mast swung the familiar red lantern, throwing a sinister gleam upon the ripples that spread before it. The craft came on with a deliberate quietness, as though the very silence of the river were its ally. Upon reaching the wharf, the crew moved swiftly to their task. One sprang ashore with a coil of rope, another guided the vessel against the piles, while a third began unloading the heavy crates with a practiced hand. Their movements betrayed neither haste nor hesitation. It was the ordered routine of men well versed in knightly commerce. I glanced at Holmes, who inclined his head almost imperceptibly. The net was closing, yet the unsuspecting quarry pursued its work in blind confidence. The red lantern swayed gently above them, its glow serving as signal alike to their comrades and to those who, unseen, lay in wait. The tension of the moment was so acute that I scarce dared to breathe. Each second seemed an hour, and I felt my hand stray instinctively toward the revolver at my side, though I knew that the decisive word must come from Holmes. It was at the instant when the largest crate had been swung to the quay that Holmes stepped forward into the open, his tall figure emerging from the gloom like some embodiment of fate. "Gentlemen," said he, in a voice calm yet carrying, "your labours are at an end." At the same moment, Lestrade's men sprang from their concealment, surrounding the crew upon every side. For a heartbeat, there was utter stillness. Then came a cry of rage, and the wharf was alive with tumult. One man struck savagely at an officer with a length of iron, another attempted to fling himself into the river, while a third brandished a knife that gleamed wickedly in the lantern light. I confess, my blood ran hot as I witnessed the sudden violence, but the constables, well prepared, closed in with practiced resolution. Blows were exchanged, curses rang out, and the splash of the river mingled with the clash of struggle. Through it all, Holmes stood unmoved, his eyes fixed upon one figure at the rear, who had yet to stir though his authority was plain upon every line of his bearing. It was toward this silent commander that Holmes advanced, and in that moment I knew we stood upon the threshold of revelation. Holmes halted before the man, who shrank a step as the lantern light revealed his face. It was none other than the foreign gentleman I had glimpsed in the warehouse, his dark eyes flashing defiance even as the cordon of police closed about him. His coat, richly cut, bespoke one who commanded rather than obeyed, and the demeanour of the captured men confirmed it. "You have directed these operations with skill," Holmes observed evenly, "but skill will avail little when the ledgers, the consignments, and your own crew testify against you." The man muttered an oath in his native tongue, and for a moment I thought he would hurl himself upon Holmes. Yet the sudden collapse of his followers, struck down or seized in the melee, robbed him of all power. He stood rigid, his hands clenched, while Lestrade, flushed with triumph, gave the order for his arrest. To me, it seemed that the mystery was now complete, the smuggling ring broken, its leader in custody. Yet Holmes's expression remained curiously detached, as though he looked beyond the man before him to some darker truth, yet unrevealed. His gaze swept past the barge, the crates, and the struggling crew, and I knew that in his mind the case was not yet closed. When the last of the men had been secured, Holmes turned quietly to Lestrade. "You have your smugglers, Inspector, but the murderer of Henry Hargreaves stands not among them." Lestrade stared in astonishment. "Not among them? Why, we have their leader here, and was it not their plot the clerk discovered?" "Assuredly it was their plot," Holmes replied. "But the man who struck the fatal blow was neither this foreign organiser, nor any of his crew. Their methods are subtle and far-reaching, yet they do not murder needlessly. The death of the clerk was the act of one nearer to him, driven not by policy, but by fear." He beckoned forward a pale-faced man who had been seized among the lesser assistants, a shipping clerk of the very warehouse where Hargreaves had worked. At first he protested feebly, but Holmes's words cut through his denials with merciless precision. "The torn cuff, Watson, you will recall. It was grasped by this fellow as he strove to wrench the warning letter from Hargreaves' hand. The footprints at the lock, they match his boots precisely. And above all, the words we overheard. Hargreaves knew too much. Who but a colleague, privy to his suspicions, could have uttered them with such personal dread? The man's composure crumbled, his eyes darted wildly, and at last he sank into silence, his guilt plain to all. Holmes folded his arms, his gaze as cold as the river mist. Thus you see, Lestrade, that smuggling was the cause, but fear was the weapon. The foreigner commanded the scheme, but it was this wretched creature who, in a moment of desperation, consigned an innocent man to the waters of the canal. It was in the familiar sitting room of Baker Street that the tangled skein at last began to unwind beneath Holmes's unerring hand. The fog of Limehouse still clung to my garments, and Lestrade, flushed with his night's exertions, sat stiffly upon the edge of his chair. Miss Hargreaves, pale yet resolute, had joined us at Holmes's request, her anxious eyes fixed upon his every movement. My friend himself leaned back in his armchair, fingertips together, his manner composed, his voice even and deliberate. "Each case, Watson, is but a chain," he remarked, "and each link must be fitted to its neighbour until the whole lies clear before us. You have seen the outward events. Allow me now to supply the inner connection." With that he began, in tones free of flourish yet weighted with precision, to reconstruct the strange sequence which had brought us from a drowned clerk on Regent's Canal to the capture of a smuggling syndicate at Limehouse. The glow of the fire played across his features, throwing them into sharp relief, and I thought once more how singular was the contrast between his austere calm and the fevered passions which his investigation so often unveiled. Holmes inclined his head toward Miss Hargreaves as he continued. The lock, madam, served two masters. To the casual observer, it was but a device to raise and lower barges between different levels of the canal. Yet to the smuggler, it offered a chamber of concealment where rising water covered their illicit cargo, and the falling tide released it to the hands of confederates. Lestrade uttered a grunt of comprehension, though I saw by his expression that the full ingenuity of the contrivance had only then struck him. Holmes pressed on. "But what can hide bales and boxes may also hide a body. To cast a man into the river is to invite discovery upon the next tide. To cast him into the lock is to delay discovery until the sluices release him. Thus, the very mechanism of honest commerce was turned into the tool of a calculated crime." Miss Hargreaves shuddered, and I myself could not repress a chill as I imagined the swirling waters swallowing their victim, only to yield him up when the hour was long past. Holmes's tone never faltered. He spoke as though describing an instrument, not an act of violence, and therein lay the cold impressiveness of his logic. Holmes now leaned forward, his keen gaze fixed upon Miss Hargreaves. "Your brother was not marked out for destruction by chance. He was diligent, exact, and honest, qualities ill-suited to the schemes carried on about him. In examining the manifests, he stumbled upon discrepancies too great to be set down to error. He saw the truth of the contraband, and once that truth was glimpsed, his fate was sealed." The young lady's hands trembled, yet she did not look away. "He spoke of shadows on the towpath," Holmes continued, "because he was watched. They knew he suspected. He lingered over his ledgers too long, and when he attempted to commit his knowledge to paper, his enemies struck." Holmes's words fell with the quiet inevitability of a judge pronouncing sentence. In that instant, I perceived how slender is the veil between the routines of daily labour and the darker forces which prey upon them. Hargreaves had but performed his duty with care, and by that very diligence he had exposed himself to mortal danger. The irony of it weighed heavily upon me, and I saw its reflection in Holmes's eyes, though his tone remained strictly analytical. "Now," Holmes resumed, "let us turn to what may seem the trifles, but which, as you know, Watson, are often the hinges upon which destiny turns. The torn cuff, the ink stains upon the fingers. What tale do they tell? Lestrade stirred, as though uncertain. Holmes answered his own question with unhurried clarity. They tell us that Henry Harbury was writing in haste, under pressure, compelled by fear. The tear upon the sleeve was not from accident, but from interruption. A hand seized him as he bent over his paper, wrenching both sheet and garment in the struggle. That he did not finish his warning is proof enough that his adversary was at hand. That the ink clung still to his fingers shows that the effort was moments only before his death. Miss Harbury pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her eyes glistening. Holmes inclined his head gravely, but did not relent. Thus, a small rent in cloth and a few stains of ink become, when read aright, the testimony of the dead. Testimony stronger than any spoken word, for it admits of no falsehood. Holmes's voice softened, though its precision remained. And then we have the final utterance, the dying clue. The lock holds more than water. What could be plainer? Yet to the untrained ear it sounded but the wandering of a drowning man. He paused, his eyes narrowing. But consider it, Watson. A lock, a contrivance that conceals, delays, and holds. To say that it holds more than water is to intimate that it holds secrets, contraband, concealment, crime. It is at once the place of his death and the device of the conspiracy. Lestrade nodded slowly, the sense dawning upon him like the lifting of a veil. Miss Harbury's gaze did not falter, though she trembled visibly at the thought of her brother's final effort to guide her. Holmes's tone grew almost reverent. Few men in such extremity retain coherence. Yet Harbury contrived in that brief breath to leave a signpost, obscure to the casual, but to one acquainted with the methods of crime, as direct as a finger pointing to the very heart of the mystery. As he spoke, I could not but feel a sombre admiration for the dead clerk, whose courage, in the hour of drowning, had aided the cause of justice more than he could have dreamt. Holmes at last rose, pacing the hearth with his hands behind his back. Thus we see how the fragments unite. The lock, a chamber of concealment. The red lantern, a signal for nocturnal labour. The foreign organiser, the mind that directed the scheme. And lastly, the clerk's fellow, whose terror of exposure drove him to the irrevocable deed. Lestrade shifted uneasily. Then the murder lay not with the foreigner. Precisely so. He was a schemer, but not a fool. He needed clerks and records, not corpses floating at his door. But to the co-worker, whose name was already bound to the falsified manifests, discovery meant ruin. In panic, he silenced Harbury by the surest means at hand. Thus, crime breeds crime, and one deceit leads, inevitably, to another. Holmes's words fell into the silence of the room. Miss Harbury bowed her head, her grief quiet yet dignified. For myself, I felt once more that mingling of awe and melancholy which so often accompanied Holmes's revelations, awe at the precision with which he unveiled the truth, and melancholy at the thought of lives ruined by greed and fear upon the murky waters of the canal. The moment Holmes's calm words laid bare the truth, the guilty clerk's composure shattered. His face, pale as parchment, twitched with sudden terror, and before Lestrade could raise a hand, he bolted. With a cry, half of rage, half of despair, he dashed from the circle of constables and bounded down the quay. The night swallowed him at once. His figure flickered like a phantom in the fog, and then only the sound of his frantic footsteps remained. "After him!" Lestrade shouted, though the command was scarcely needed. Holmes was already in motion, his long strides carrying him with astonishing swiftness along the narrow towpath. I followed as best I could, my heart pounding, the mist closing about me like a curtain. The clerk's silhouette loomed ahead for an instant, then vanished once more into the vapour. The lantern light of the constables bobbed and danced behind us, casting grotesque shadows on the warehouses, while the river echoed the hurried patter of feet and the harsh rasp of hurried breath. It was a pursuit less of flesh and blood than of some shadow born of guilt, fleeing blindly into the night, as though the very air of London rose against him. We pressed on, our lanterns casting faint circles that did little to dispel the gloom. The towpath wound treacherously along the water's edge, and more than once I felt the damp stones slip beneath my boots. Ahead, the fugitive's footfalls rang sharp, irregular, betraying his mounting desperation. Holmes ran with unerring certainty, his eyes fixed on the faintest trace, while Lestrade and his men followed in a ragged line. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water, and the mist clung close, muffling sound so that each cry or splash seemed strangely magnified. At one point, the echo of footsteps ceased, and for a dreadful instant I thought we had lost him. Then came the sound of a stumble, followed by a frantic scramble, and once again the chase resumed. My breath came in laboured gasps, yet Holmes moved as though borne on some inner compulsion, his lean form tireless, relentless. The canal itself lay like a strip of black glass beside us, reflecting only the faint glow of the lanterns. It seemed to watch the chase with silent malice, as though waiting to exact its toll. The fugitive was being driven ever nearer to its fatal embrace. At last, the outline of the lock loomed ahead, its gates rising dark and massive against the faint glow of the fog-dimmed lamps. The clerk, now utterly spent, cast a wild glance behind him and, with the frenzy of despair, rushed toward it. "Stop!" cried Lestrade, but the words were swallowed by the night. The man, heedless, made a desperate leap, seeking to clear the narrow span where the gates met. For a heartbeat it seemed he might succeed. Then his foot struck the slick timber, and with a cry that rang horribly across the water, he toppled headlong into the black abyss below. The splash resounded, followed by the violent thrashing of limbs as he fought against the current. The lantern light wavered over the dark surface, revealing only eddies and foam. I ran forward, peering helplessly into the gloom, but the depth and swiftness of the waters rendered aid impossible. Holmes, arriving at my side, stood motionless, his gaze fixed upon the lock. His expression was one of grave inevitability, as though he had foreseen the end long before. "The lock, Watson," he murmured, "has claimed its own." For a few moments we could hear the frantic sounds of the drowning man. His arms struck wildly against the surface, sending up showers of spray that caught the lantern light. A hoarse cry broke from his lips, the last vestige of human will against the inexorable force of water. Then came silence. The canal closed over him as though he had never been. Only the faint swirl of bubbles and the ripple of the tide bore witness to his passing. Lestrade, panting heavily from the chase, leaned upon the railing, his face pale in the glow. "It is over," he muttered. Holmes said nothing. His eyes followed the eddies with a detached calm that seemed almost chilling. I confess a sense of awe overcame me, for it was as though we had witnessed the direct hand of retribution, swift and merciless. The very element he had employed to cloak his crime had risen to become his executioner. The men stood in hushed silence, their lanterns casting tremulous reflections upon the dark water. A profound stillness descended, broken only by the distant lap of the tide, as if the city itself paused to acknowledge the finality of the deed. Holmes turned at last, his voice low and measured. "There is a grim symmetry in this, Watson. The lock that served as his chosen instrument of concealment has now become his grave. He who sought to smother truth beneath its waters has himself been smothered." I could not but shiver at the words. The image of Harbury, dragged down by treachery into the same pitiless depths, rose vividly before me. Now his murderer had followed, swallowed by the very contrivance that had disguised his deed. It was justice of a sort, though stern and untempered. Lestrade drew a long breath. "A trial would have been better," he said, though without conviction. "Perhaps," replied Holmes, "yet there are times when the law of circumstance proves swifter than the law of man. The canal has rendered a verdict which no jury could gainsay." His tone was not exultant, but grave, tinged with that peculiar melancholy which so often tempered his triumphs. In that moment, I felt the weight of the city pressing close about us, its shadows deep with crimes, its waters reflecting not only its commerce, but its hidden tragedies. Dawn was breaking as we retraced our steps along the towpath. A pale light spread through the mist, turning the water a dull silver, while the faint stirrings of the city began to rise in the distance. Holmes walked beside me in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, his features composed but thoughtful. At length he spoke. "London is a vast organism, Watson. Its heart beats in commerce, its breath in smoke and fog, but in its veins run also the darker currents of avarice and fear. Last night, we traced but one of those currents to its bitter end." I could find no words in answer. The image of the drowning man, the echo of his final cry, and the memory of Miss Hargreaves' quiet sorrow weighed heavily upon me. Holmes glanced at me, and a faint, sardonic smile touched his lips. "We are but observers, my dear fellow, chroniclers of human folly and fate. Yet perhaps, in shedding light upon such shadows, we lessen their power." So we passed back into the awakening city, the fog lifting slowly behind us, while the canal, calm once more, bore its silent testimony to the tragedy that had unfolded upon its waters. Holmes and I paused upon the quiet towpath, the dawn mist still clinging to the water like a shroud. My friend regarded the dark surface of the loch with that distant, meditative gaze I had come to know so well. "You see, Watson," he said at length, "crime so often contrives to mask itself by turning the instruments of honest labour into its accomplices. Yet in the end, it is not the cunning of man, but the inevitability of consequence, which brings such schemes undone." The loch held more than water. Indeed, it held the truth itself. I remained silent, struck by the irony that the very contrivance which had concealed one death had claimed another. Holmes drew his cloak about him, adding softly, "Retribution, though delayed, is seldom denied. And now, I put a question to you. What do you think was the murderer's greatest error? The attempt to silence Harbury, or the belief that the canal itself would keep his secret forever? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this mystery, I invite you to comment, subscribe, and share it with others who delight in the shadows of Holmes's London. More cases await, and together we shall unravel them.